Welcome to the Engage podcast brought to you by Boodle, the most rewarding way to pay. If you haven't already, get onto the App Store and download Boodle. That's Boodil. The Engage podcast is where we speak to some of the most inspiring entrepreneurs and business leaders. In this episode, we are joined by Luke Hemsley, the founder of Wednesdays Domaine, the alcohol-free wine business that is taking the UK by storm. Luke has an eclectic career from working at a global trading firm to a startup in the fintech space, all the way through to his latest endeavour, which focuses on the alcohol-free segment of the market. He is now selling his products across a number of independent retailers and bars across the UK. This is a great episode for anyone looking at setting a business up, with Luke going into the gritty details of getting a product off the ground and into physical outlets. Thanks for joining us today, Luke.
Thank you for having me.
Brilliant. So we kicked the podcast off with an impactful question, and that's the same with every guest. And it's what is the biggest challenge you've faced so far in your journey?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a big question. I would say there's probably two ways of answering that. One is if I think about journey as in career to date, and the other is probably with Wednesdays Domaine. I'll talk a bit about the former because that really informs what I'm up to now. I would say the biggest thing that I've wrestled with since I joined kind of the working world is working out what the hell I wanted to do, what I was good at, how I defined what I was. And I would say for a long time, I've kind of been a generalist. I've avoided being pigeonholed into certain roles, whether that's a sales role or an operational role or something else entirely, and really resisted certain labels or being in certain functions. And I think I'm still not there yet, but one of the things that I've loved about setting up Wednesdays Domaine and being a founder is being able to embrace that idea of being a generalist and moving between different parts of the business, different skill sets, which is something we were talking about just as I arrived in terms of the sheer variety of running your own business.
Yeah, as a sole founder as
exactly.
well. Yeah. Brilliant.
Exactly.
Love it. Brilliant. So let's go back to the early days. Obviously, we know what you're doing now and we will go into that. But let's talk about your foundations, where you grew up, who you are as a person, and obviously what's led you to, being an entrepreneur today.
Yeah, of course. So foundations, I would say I would be lying if I said that, I wasn't very fortunate to have a lovely upbringing. I'm part of a family of five, so parents and then two sisters, two younger sisters, Maddie and Ellie, went to school just outside of London and then went up to university in the northeast, went to Durham.
Oh, nice.
And probably...
They threw you up there, did they?
Exactly. a lot of people's idea of a kind of the embodiment of a Durham student, whether that's a good or a bad thing, I don't know. But from there, I studied economics at university and had a sense of what I wanted to do, but wasn't massively clear in that. To give you a bit of context, my dad had always been in the city, was always very interested in markets. I was always very interested in markets, kind of as a result of those kind of conversations I would often have with him growing up. Studied things like economics and history, was very interested in geopolitics at A-level and that sort of thing. So ended up going into commodities and spent 3 years working as a commodities trader for a large American company. Wow. A company called Cargill, who had offices all over the world. I had this idea of kind of traveling to these far-flung places, and the reality was that I spent 3 years in an office and a lot of time in a car, and it was kind of very, very unglamorous, but an amazing foundation, and that was kind of very commercially focused. And is it worth Harry me going from there to where we are now?
But just very quickly, what was your sort of role and what were your learnings from that business then? Talk us through a little bit about that then, your experience
of course.
there.
So that was interesting in a couple of respects. So if someone said to me, what did you do for 3 years working for Cargill? I would say I was a commodities trader. So I traded oil seeds, which are effectively rapeseed, soybeans. Very kind of unglamorous, a lot of people would say, why the hell would you do that? The scheme I was part of was amazing. It was called the Commercial Management Trainee Scheme.
Okay.
And essentially they were finding people who would be, commercial leaders within the business in the future, whether that was, leading a trading division, so moving commodities from A to B, or leading a sales function. And essentially what you learned there were the mechanics of a business, of a small business. Each desk was effectively its own small business unit. It had a profit and loss account. You had people who worked on those desks. You had people who worked in kind of ancillary functions, and you learned how to manage people, how to manage a P&L. You also learned that nothing ever goes to plan and things go wrong. And I think probably the most relevant experience to what I'm doing now with Wednesdays Domain is that physical products are a nightmare. And they break and they go off and they, things don't arrive on time or things arrive too early. And that is probably my biggest takeaway from my time at Cargill. The other interesting thing about that time was that business was enormous. It's frequently referred to as the largest business you've never heard of. It's kind of 100 billion revenue plus business. And we dealt with a lot of smaller players and that imbalance of power was often quite interesting. And as a very small business now, I feel that a lot. I'm on the receiving end of that. I'm on the other side of that coin. And I think that has really informed, again, a lot of how I kind of behave and interact when I'm dealing with larger businesses now.
Nice. So you spent 3 years there.
Yeah.
And then
essentially realized two things. One, I was pretty bang average at trading. I was never going to be a great trader, and a lot of the people around me were kind of far better. The other thing I realized...
What was the difference there then? So from your analysis, you probably were a very good trader. I'm sure you were. But what was the different sort of skill sets?
I think there were a few things. One, they lived and breathed it. They spent a lot of their own time, a lot of spare time really understanding the nuts and bolts of trading. And I think I wasn't all in. I didn't fully commit myself to that. They were incredibly numerate in a way that I could get by, but wasn't, we're talking kind of Rain Man level stuff here. I think that they were, they knew that's what they wanted to do. So those people were willing to stay the course, willing to invest with a kind of 10, 15, 20 year time horizon. And that just wasn't me. And so to answer the question you started answering, which was what next, I basically realized that I wanted to set up my own business. But I also realized I had no idea how to set up my own business. I realized that elements of what I'd done at Cargo were useful, but other elements weren't. And so I made the transition into working for startups, and I moved across into a fintech startup, which is very relevant to Boodle and this conversation today. And I joined a business called Market Invoice, which then became Market Finance, is now called Korea, just after they raised their Series A. So they were about 60 people, and they grew to about 100 in the 18 months that I was there.
Wow.
And I joined them in an account management function. And turned up and didn't have a Scooby as to what was happening. I remember someone week one saying, "Let's talk about your funnel. Let's talk about." I was like, "What's a funnel?" So the guy sitting next to me, but I loved it, and that was the beginning of working for a couple of different startups and this path towards one day setting up my own business.
Oh, brilliant. So what was the transition like? Obviously, you've mentioned there that you've come in as an account manager. There's certain things you didn't know, but I suppose going from that, a 100 billion turnover company to a company that's raised a Series A, I presume they were potentially burning money each month.
Yeah,
and,
they were,
and there's all that. So I suppose what was the transition like, going from a huge company like that to a startup then like that?
Yeah, it's really interesting to reflect on. I think the first thing to say is there are a lot of people who were in a similar boat, and it was an amazing time to be at that business because you had this complete melting pot of characters that had come from different industries, different roles, different backgrounds, different nationalities, all of whom were kind of interested in being part of what was a very nascent London fintech scene at the time and being part of a growing startup basically. So that transition was amazing in many respects. It taught me a lot about startups. It helped me learn the language of startups. Again, I didn't really know what a Series A was. I didn't really understand valuations. I didn't know about sales funnels. I didn't appreciate the difference how you build a product and all those sorts of things, and how you get a product to market. So I'd always just taken those as a given because I'd worked for a big business that had done that, because I'd always done that. So that was a massive learning, I'd say, really understanding the nuts and bolts, also understanding that the best laid plans often go to waste, and startups often raise money on a plan. Again, we touched on this previously, and that plan will inevitably differ. And so it kind of taught me the importance of having a sense of where you want to get to, but being open in how you get there. And so I think that was probably a big learning.
Brilliant. And how long did you spend there then?
So I spent 18 months there.
Okay.
And then I got two very fortunate and impactful things happened at that stage. So one was when I was at Market Invoice, a friend of mine who had helped me navigate that transition from a corporate into a startup, he was running his own startup, approached me and said, look, when I tell you I meet these people for dinner and I've met the founder of XYZ, there's a bit more of a structure behind that, and it's actually a small community that I've set up. It's getting a bit too much to run ourselves. Would you come in and run it?
Oh, wow.
There are about 100 founders of some of the country's most interesting startups.
Wow.
We can't pay you, but you can be the only person in this community who isn't a founder. And by the way, we have a call at 6:45 on a Wednesday morning, 6:45 a.m. You in? And you're going to need to work on Sundays and all this sort of stuff. And I was like, count me in. This sounds incredible. And the other thing that happened was I got approached by a woman, or got introduced to a woman called Caroline Plum, who went on to found a business that I then joined called Fluidly.
Okay.
And she was a serial entrepreneur. She is a serial entrepreneur. She'd previously run a recruitment business and innovation consultancy. And she said, look, I hear you're interested in early stage businesses. I'm setting up this business. It's in fintech again. Do you want to have a chat? And that conversation effectively materialized in terms of, I need a bit of a, dog's body, jack of all trades. Are you interested? And again, the answer was yes. It was kind of like, I'll come along for the ride, and I'll do all the stuff you don't want to do, but you kind of teach me how you set up, run, and scale a business.
And what did they do? What did Fluidly?
So we had something which we branded as an intelligent cash flow engine.
Okay.
But in effect, we were helping small businesses manage their cash flow. It was this idea that a lot of what is done when it comes to cash flow management in small businesses, A, pretty much isn't done, and B, if you speak to your accountant, it's often backward looking. It's what has happened, and if you do anything forward looking, it either costs loads of money or you just do it in a notebook, which is, to be honest, what a lot of people do, and I understand that a bit more now that I'm running my own business. But that was a business that kind of grew over 4 or 5 years.
So you were there for 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, so I was there.
First employee as well?
So joined as the first employee,
wow.
Joined Caroline and the then co-founder Dom, who was the CTO.
Nice.
And we sat in a kind of smelly, dark corner by the loo of in the office of one of her other businesses. Caroline had raised a small angel round to kind of grow that team out. And there were quickly kind of 4 or 5 of us, and that business grew to kind of 50, 60 people.
Wow.
Got acquired in December 2020 or 2021. Wow. I can't remember.
So you were, what was your role, out of curiosity, when you joined? What is it, sort of
so
open title?
It's funny you say that. I was actually thinking about this morning, and that I used to care so much about job title because that that was one of the ways that you benchmarked yourself and also helped you to talk about what you've done when you get to the next stage. So had a few different roles there. The first one was customer success. So effectively worked with our early customers to really flesh out the product, and we had no idea what the product would be then. So that role was very much a kind of commercial but also a product role. And I'd say my biggest learning there, which really helps me a lot on Wednesdays Domaine now, is to be very problem focused rather than solution orientated. And that was something that Caroline drilled into me early on, really get into why that's an issue for the customer, really get into their pain points. And so effectively our first part of the product was credit control. And I basically did credit control for about 5 other businesses for probably 3-4 months. So a lot of on the phone, a lot of email, really at the kind of quite harsh and gnarly end of small businesses. And again, seeing the way that small businesses really do have a tough time when they get those dream clients, those corporate clients, but then they don't pay them for 90 days. So, that was, to answer your question, that was the first role. Then had a role called head of engagement, which was basically around onboarding our new kind of corporate accounting clients. and then moved into an ops director role. And the reason that I did that, the woman who was in that role ended up leaving, and there was a kind of conversation as to whether I would take it on, and I ended up doing it because it was one of the few areas of the business that I hadn't been involved with, and I wanted to be knowing that I was ready to set up my own business. So I wanted to understand how HR works. I wanted to deal with regulatory frameworks and all that unbelievably unsexy stuff that is so core to how any business operates. Exactly. So that was kind of where I ended up.
Brilliant.
Prior to Wednesdays Domaine.
And then you left after the sale. What was that?
Yeah. So I left. I left 2 months before the sale was announced. I'd started working on Wednesdays Domain by that point, and one of the incredibly lucky things or fortunate elements of Fluidly was when I first joined, I'd always said to Caroline, one day I want to go and set up my own business, as I mentioned. That was kind of central to that conversation. So when I started working on Wednesdays Domain, which was kind of late summer 2020 during one of the first COVID lockdowns, by the time I was ready to incorporate that business, and I spoke to Caroline, she was kind of very open to that, and she actually offered me something that I was going to propose, which was going down to part-time. So in May of the next year, so May 2021, I went down to working 3 days a week at Fluidly and doing 2 days a week on what became Wednesdays Domain. So I basically spent 5 months working part-time on the business, and then went full-time in October 2021. And that was actually a fantastic run-off to have, because there wasn't enough to do in the business for 5 days a week at that point, as you would have experienced. Yeah.
So to talk us through, though, the ideation, then let's go back to, obviously you want to set up a business. You've spent, the last few years in commodity trading, then a fintech, then another fintech, and obviously all this experience, which is fantastic, but then non-alcoholic wines. And so
it's a bit of a leap. I think we're all quite good at as humans of kind of piecing things together and telling stories. But if you met me for the first time or you looked on a piece of paper, you think this guy is seriously indecisive. So I guess just going a step before that, which I think is really important to this. I basically realized during COVID, I think a lot of us had time to stop, to reflect on what we wanted, to have a proper think. And I realized that there was a very real risk that if I didn't properly think about what I wanted to do, the type of business I want to set up, that I would never do it. And I would just be that guy, bitter guy, 20, 30 years down the line in a pub saying to his mates, well, next year's going to be the year. And so I basically tried to put a bit of a framework around it. So I spent a lot of time looking at businesses to try and find businesses I admired and what they had in common. And two things came out of that. One was that they had physical products, and the second was that they were rooted in some kind of delightful customer experience. And what I mean by that is, so commodity is a physical product, but there's no customer experience. It's a very kind of business to business operation. This had to be a kind of consumer facing product. And so that's that part. In terms of why non-alcoholic wine, my wife Hannah and I spent some time with my parents, with her parents during the lockdowns. They're both pretty old school. They both drink a lot, like a lot of people's parents or that generation. Not necessarily in a problematic way, but every evening there's a glass of wine, there's a beer, there's a gin and tonic, there's whatever you want. And during COVID, a lot of people did do that. That's an experience that was common to a lot of people. And I quickly realized, whilst it was fun, it wasn't particularly sustainable. It wasn't compatible with staying mentally and physically fit. It wasn't compatible with having a busy job, albeit we were doing those jobs remotely. And so I went to the supermarket and looked at alcohol-free. And what I found was an amazing growth in the variety and the quality of alcohol-free beers, alcohol-free spirits, very similar. And what I found in wine was in no way comparable. There was a complete absence of quality and a complete absence of brand. The liquids that you would find felt like afterthoughts. They felt like products that people had released because they thought they should. And so figured there was an opportunity for a great tasting, beautifully branded alcohol-free wine, and was entirely naive to how hard that is. It's probably a good place
That's
to
a
start.
good exactly. Naivety can be the best reason to start a business. So talk us through then. Obviously, you've come up with the idea. Love it, brilliant. You've done your research. like obviously that's one part of it.
Yeah.
Actually bringing that to life. You talk to me about how you actually manufacture this product, who you go and speak to, you know, how you bring this to life, and then obviously, you know, a few steps ahead of that, how do you actually get the product into the hands of customers as well? So
it's a with any product, whether it's a technology product or a physical product, I think that process is extremely hard and rarely straightforward, and also, unless you have deep sector experience or understanding, it's very non-obvious. Basically, you're like, how the hell do I do this? So effectively, I went and asked a load of people, you know, how do you set up a physical product business? How do you set up a food and drink business? And I was lucky that through that network that I mentioned that I'd helped to run, there were people I could go to. So, you know, there was a guy who'd previously run a pork scratching company. There was another woman who'd previously run a feminine hygiene product. You know, she'd brought a physical product to market. And so, and at the end of all of those conversations, there was one question I would ask everyone, which was, who else should I be speaking to?
Okay.
And that would always yield kind of 2 or 3 introductions, always. And I always still ask that question. And it's amazing how much of what's happened in Wednesdays Domain is the result of a second or third degree introduction, basically. You know, that just rolling on and on. So, to answer the question again.
Production, manufacturing.
Exactly. So it became pretty obvious that if you want to create a new food or drink product, so if you want to create a chocolate bar, an energy bar, an alcohol-free wine, there are product developers that you can go to, and often these people have worked for big companies. So in food, and then now they've set up on their own, or they're a freelancer or whatever. So they may have worked for Mars or Diageo or whatever. Had a load of conversations there. Ended up working with an agency who created both food and drink products. One of the founders of that business was really passionate about wine, used to work in the wine industry, and the other founder had been a chef in a Michelin-starred restaurant. And that combination was really important to me in terms of, you know, how do you create liquids that pair really well with foods, which is so central to the experience of wine. They then developed the wines. That took a long time. You know, we had a brief around the liquids we were trying to create, and I can go into that in more detail later if needs be. Yeah. But we created these beautiful liquids in, you know, a litre bottle. It's then like, right, how do we turn this into 1,000 litres? Yeah. And finding someone to do that in the UK is unbelievably hard. The infrastructure that exists to bottle wine is very limited, and the infrastructure to bottle non-alcoholic wine is almost non-existent because you have to go through extra preservation stages because you don't have any alcohol. And the way that I found the people that we do that with now was through speaking to a competitor who I'd resisted speaking to for a long time, and someone looped me in with them, and I just kind of bared my soul and said, I'm in a bit of a hole here, I don't really know what to do. And he said, oh, just ring these people, they're great. I spoke to them the next day, and they're like, you know, we're having a trial a month later. And so again, it's amazing how these things can kind of come about.
Brilliant.
And the second part of your question was, how do you then get that out there? We ended up thinking, you know, what are our channel strategies? And again, if you're not familiar with channels, it's kind of, what are the different options that we have to get this product in people's hands? So one channel common to a wine is retail, for example. So supermarkets, wine shops, delis. Another are restaurants, bars, pubs. Another is direct to consumer, so through our website. We decided to pursue all of those channels, and very much taking the approach that we would put our wines in places where you know, consumers would look for them, essentially. So kind of tried various different avenues.
This podcast is brought to you by Boodle, the cardless payment solution which offers significantly reduced fees, instant settlement of funds, and eradicates fraud and chargebacks. Boodle can sit on your e-commerce checkout as an alternative payment solution, or can offer clients a fully customized payment portal to send out payment links. What's better is that Boodle rewards customers with redeemable points every time they check out. If you haven't already, get onto the App Store and download Boodle now. Amazing, brilliant. I want to go back to, because I'm really curious about this, the product creation. You talk about using that agency.
Yeah.
Who is deciding what tastes good, what doesn't taste good.
Yeah.
I mean, is that just you and the agency? You sending samples out to people? How are you getting this feedback?
It's a really, really interesting question. And it's probably worth just talking a bit about how we approach the development as well.
Please. Because I'm curious to, as well, from your perspective as well, you might go into this, whether you're trying to find something that tastes exactly like a wine, or something that you can tell is not a real wine but tastes good. Do you see what I mean?
No, it's a great question, and it's something that I think about on a daily basis. So if we break down what's happening in non-alcoholic wines, if you think about something like beer, effectively people are saying, look, we're going to create a like-for-like product. It's pretty much the same. That's it. If you look at non-alcoholic wine, what you have are two different parts of the market. You have de-alkalized wines, which are wines that have been fermented to full strength and then they've had the alcohol removed through various different processes. And I won't bore you with those, but there are kind of three core processes that you hear people talk about. And then you have things like kombuchas and sparkling teas and water kefirs, which are complex, interesting, often fermented products, but they don't taste anything like wine. But certain restaurants will say, this is our non-alcoholic wine pairing, for example. My view and our view as a team was very much, the product that will win needs to be as close as possible to the experience of drinking wine. So what we do is use de-alkalized wines. We bring them in from central Spain, a place called La Mancha, which is an enormous wine growing region. We bring them in as de-alkalized wines and we blend them with some natural flavors, natural ingredients to rebuild that flavor profile. So if you think about drinking a wine, it has a flavor, but it also has a texture, but you hear people talk about body and mouthfeel. It has an aroma as well. It has length to it, it sticks around, it lingers in the way that if you drink a soft drink like a Lucozade, it doesn't. So we very much took that approach. And so to come back to that point, we're trying to create something that is wine-like in a number of respects, albeit recognizing that it's almost impossible as things stand to create something that is, blind taste test, for like an alcoholic wine.
Amazing. Brilliant. So, and on that point as well about the friends, family testing, do you get a lot of people just sort of...
Yeah, and you asked me a question before, which was, how does that tasting process go? A lot of it was involves kind of, we would taste internally, and the way that it worked is I would turn up at the agency and they would say, look, here are 10 different liquids and here's what we've done to them. Do we dial up, do we bring in more citrus elements, or do we look to add in nuttier elements, or do we increase the body? But if we increase the body, we do that through sugar, which makes it more calorific and sweeter. And so you're constantly working out these trade-offs. And prior to that, I'd essentially created a brief where I looked at, the most consumed wines in the UK, looked at the wines that pair well with a wide variety of foods, and then looked at those descriptors. So if you think about how people talk about wine, they often talk about fruits or vegetables, or think sometimes ridiculous things like forest floor or flint or whatever. They sound ridiculous if you're coming from outside it, but are really useful ways of navigating flavors and tastes. And basically said to the development team, I don't care how we get here, but let's try and ape certain styles or varietals of wine. And that's another good example of just thinking about the problem you're trying to solve rather than being too focused on how you're going to solve it. And what I'd do is then take those liquids home to my parents' house, to my in-laws. It just so happened that we were often going to friends' houses the weekends that I would get those. So I would just say, do you mind tasting this? And I wouldn't tell people too much about it. Partly because I was really nervous about what they would think, and the other part is I didn't want to colour what they would say back to me, and I would just watch them sip it, and if they go back, and I'd make notes, and it's a bit weird sitting with your mates just making notes. Exactly, but it was a super, super useful experience. Amazing.
Brilliant. So you've got the product now. You've found, the solution essentially, and you've got the contact to where to manufacture the product. So what now? Obviously, how do you get this produced? What kind of money is involved in terms of, are you putting your own, sort of financial finance at risk, or have you looked at seek external sort of investment for this?
So I've, I guess there are a few different ways you can look at funding. So one is I've put some of my own money in, and that's come from savings. And again, I was incredibly lucky to have had an okay job through a pandemic where we were all just sitting at home. So I basically had 12 months of saving up paychecks and had a small amount of savings alongside that, and a lot of that has gone in to the extent where there's not much left basically, but there's enough. I've raised money a couple of times, and we can talk a bit about that. And the other element we're now looking at is grant funding.
Oh, brilliant.
And so we're looking at applying for an Innovate UK grant, and that was something we did a lot of at Fluidly. And so that was, again, a massively formative and useful experience in terms of understanding that is a funding route that a lot of businesses either aren't aware of or don't take advantage of.
Amazing.
And so, in terms of, what does it cost to create something like this? The first bit of money that I raised was £105,000, which again was quite scary. I was coming from tech, and in tech people talk about millions, and you're raising 100,000. Everyone's like, okay, well, what? You can't do much with that. That can get you an unbelievably long way, and you just have to be frugal and make more good decisions than bad decisions, basically. I'm not going to sit here and say I've made only good decisions, but all of that money pretty much went into product and brand development.
Okay.
And the thinking there was, and that was where I was really lucky to be working part-time through a lot of that. So I had, again, a salary coming in. But the thinking there was the two things that matter most are, would someone pull it off a shelf? So it has to have a great brand that connects with people. And once they do, will they go back to it?
Yeah.
And so that was, everything went into product and brand development. And I think this is quite a unpopular opinion within food and drink and physical product, but I think we have a very, very good product, but I think there's still room to improve both our liquid and our brand. And I'm super excited about that and the path we're on there as well.
Amazing. And the brand name, what's the rationale and reasoning behind that?
Yeah, so the brand name, Wednesdays Domaine, ultimately we want to be people's midweek wine alternative. And so we're for food and drink lovers, we're for people who enjoy a glass of wine, and we're just saying to them, we're presenting you with a different or better option at certain moments. So Wednesday is obviously your midweek, and then Domaine is a nod to kind of French wine culture.
I like it. Nice. So going back to that point, sorry to interject there, but you've got the product now. You've gone to the manufacturer to create the product, essentially. They've obviously got minimum order quantities. So at what point do you give the go-ahead? Are you starting to try and sell prior to producing, or are you going, right, I've got to produce it, and then when I've got the physical product, I can go out and sell it?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and all of this is a bit of a puzzle that you're constantly working out in terms of, what do you need to do when, what can you afford to do when. The way that most, as I understand it, food and drink products work is that when you're working with a new manufacturer, you'll do a trial day. And there is an expectation that, first of all, that trial day will be a much smaller volume than you'd expect to produce down the line. The other thing is there's an expectation that things will go wrong. And I remember turning up on that day and just being unbelievably nervous. And again, more things went right than went wrong, but all sorts goes wrong. But as a result of that, we ended up with 100 bottles of each wine, and I took some of those wines to restaurants in London and wine shops and friends, and got people to try them, and kind of built up an initial order quantity there to be able to tell a bit of a story to other investors, other businesses around traction, and then we went into a bigger production run. And launched with that, and there was some cash from the fundraise set aside for that initial production run. But one of the things I would say is, for a lot of businesses with a physical product, it's again balancing that need to conserve cash with the unit economics of, if you make bigger orders, you can take advantage of lower unit costs. So your labels, your bottles, all your ingredients, they all become cheaper the bigger you go. But the decision we've taken as a business over the last kind of year, 18 months is, let's stay small, let's stay nimble. We pay up a bit more on a unit basis, but I'd rather have that flexibility than put a lot of cash into stock and have it just sitting there, and you can't then dedicate it to other things should opportunities come up. But that's something that, as we mature as a business, we need to plan a little further forward. And work that sort of thing out.
Nice. So let's go back to that door knocking. You around London.
Yeah.
Primarily, I take it knocking on restaurants and bars. And taking these bottles that you've got.
Yeah.
What's the feedback like? How many are saying, yep, we'd like to order a few, and how many, are, no, not for us now?
Yeah, I would say it's, again, to one of the first things I said to you around funnels, it is all a funnel. At the top of your funnel, you have all of the restaurants, all of the wine shops in London, prospects, exactly. And then you're going through and you're meeting those. So the process quite literally is, I put my backpack on, I put the white wine in a cooler, I put the red wine, and I wrap it in a tea towel effectively. And then you pick an area and you go and speak to people there.
Brilliant.
And that again was a learning process. I had no idea how you cart wine around. I rang a guy who was one of the early sales people at Seedlip who I'd been introduced to. And he said, we used to put it in camera bags because that kind of held it upright and you could, lug a load around. But how does that work? I will pick an area. So I'm not going to end up being in London and saying, right, I'm in Hackney now, but then I need to be in Fulham and then I need to be in Peckham because it's not a good use of time. The other thing we've tried to do is focus on pockets and get a few listings there, and then you appear bigger than you are. Because if someone is just kicking around in Peckham and they see you in 3 places, in their head
you're everywhere outside of Peckham.
Everywhere. And that's quite a common strategy, and that's not unique to us. That's not original to me. But I think it's really, really helped me. And hospitality and food and drink is a real community. People who work in restaurants like going to other people's restaurants and shopping in certain wine shops and delis. But the process is literally go in, knock, ask a few questions. Again, big learning from working with Caroline that so much of sales and new business is listening rather than talking. So may I ask, do you have any non-alcoholic options right now? What are they? Who tends to drink them? Who do you work with? How often do you change your menu? Do you make the decisions? All that sort of stuff. And then if I go and see 10 or 15 wine shops, restaurants, deli in an afternoon, maybe 3 of them will taste. And from that, 1 or 2 might say, yeah, we're interested. Most, though, will say, that 8 or 12 that don't taste, you'll get their details, and then you've just got to follow up. And it's a lot of following up.
I can imagine.
But it's amazing the number of listings that we've won where someone has said 6 months down the line, oh, thanks for leaving your card. Someone asked for this the other day.
Brilliant.
And the good thing about the world that I'm in, that we're in, is people go to restaurants, people go to wine shops, people go to delis the whole time. So if I ever go for dinner or for lunch, I'll just at the end slightly sidle off and say to my wife, Hannah, I'll be back in a couple of minutes, and then just leave your card, and you never know how these things play out.
From now on, when I go to a restaurant, my first question: do you have any non-alcoholic wines? And if not, is you
exactly? Have you heard of Wednesdays Domaine?
There we go. Yeah, no, love it. So talk us through. Obviously, you start getting in some physical spaces in terms of primarily bars and restaurants early days. Yeah, so restaurants, wine shops, and delis, and that was that. Just quickly on that point, that's where again you're thinking about, okay, where are consumers enjoying the non-alcoholic products? And actually it's changing now, but a lot of people for a long time were drinking these things at home. If they were going out, they were going out. But if they were at home, they might be more comfortable, and that's because there's loads of things tied up in that. It's the mindset you're in, it's the societal pressures to drink when you're out. There's all sorts tied up in that. But coming back to that question, primarily physical spaces, so restaurants, bar, wine shops, delis. Brilliant. And how then are you approaching e-commerce and also retailers? Obviously, you've mentioned you're going for a 3-pronged attack. There's all 3 channels that you want to operate in. Where's how are you focusing on e-com and retail spaces as well? So e-commerce, we've really tried hard to kind of build, it's such an overused word in startups, but a community and a bit of a following around Wednesdays Domaine, an audience, and that started probably 6 or 7 months before we launched, where I started writing a newsletter called Table Talk, which goes out every Wednesday morning at 11:30. It has done for nearly 100 editions now. Wow. And that celebrates those kind of meandering conversations that you have with friends and family when you sit down for dinner.
And so it's honestly, absolutely everything from talking about music to restaurants to all the stuff that we talk about, right? And so that meant that when we launched, we already had, an audience of 500-600 people who were ready to buy that product.
Brilliant.
There's then kind of two elements that we've grown that primarily through paid social. So Instagram, we have a bit of a sausage machine basically, where we know that we put X amount in and Y comes out, and then the key is to retain those customers, because it's so much cheaper to retain rather than acquire customers, and that's where we've done more recently a lot of work around our kind of retention and life cycle marketing. So if someone buys something, how are we contacting them down the line? How do we better understand that audience? And a general principle we've tried to take there is, how do we enrich or make our customers' lives better through an interaction with Wednesdays Domain? And when I say enrich, I'm not talking about that in an overly high and mighty way. I'm talking about, let's create a good vibe in their house. So we will send them a playlist, or we'll send them a recipe, or we'll send them a book recommendation. Again, coming back to this idea of how are people enjoying our products, it's all rooted in that.
Nice.
And then there's been a bit of PR and that sort of thing around it, where you see little sales spikes, but primarily we've driven that through building our newsletter following, and people get 10% off their first order when they sign up for a newsletter, and then through paid social.
Amazing.
To the point around retailers, those larger retailers, and I assume you're talking about grocers, so Waitrose, Sainsbury's, that sort of thing.
Which I know are different, a completely different beast.
They're a different beast, and I think some of those conversations have happened. I think we are too early for that at the minute. I think we would get absolutely hammered on price. And I think there's a bit of a risk of kind of destroying some of the brand equity that we've built up. I don't think that's right for us yet. That's not to say that we won't be in time, but I don't think that's really a focus right now. And I'm okay with that as well. And I think, it's a really difficult thing, because your ego wants to say, well, we're listed in X or we're listed in Y, but actually you hear so many founders talk about, we got listed and then delisted and it was not a nightmare.
I can imagine. But it's just interesting, the sort of concept of the business. You went into a physical space in a supermarket, a major, saw there was nothing on the shelf. And if there was, it was probably something that wasn't that appealing. And then you've obviously created this solution to the problem, but then...
And so there'll be a nice circularity to that. And in a few years, people will be complaining about our products and setting up businesses off the back of it, I'm sure.
But just an interesting...
Yeah, definitely.
So where do you see the non-alcoholic space going? Obviously, it's growing. We both know that. But where do you see it going in the next 5 years? What are your predictions around not only the wine space, but the beer space and the non-alcoholic spirits?
It's a really, really interesting question, and one that I spend a lot of time thinking about and talking to people about. I think there are two things that will happen. So the easy narrative around this is that it's Gen Z who don't drink. And everyone says, young people don't drink, blah, blah. You can't move for headlines around that. The reality is a lot of people who buy our products are kind of late 20s, early 30s upwards through to, 60 plus. I'm useless at talking about the different generations. So I think millennials and boomers, right? I think what will happen is the market will evolve in two ways. So there is a fundamental kind of growth in demand, which I think will only go one way, and there'll be a response. There'll be a supply response to that, where more people come into the space. But I think what you'll have are two things: older people, so kind of our age and up, who have developed an interest and developed a taste for beers and wines and spirits, will continue to seek products that taste like those products and replicate that experience of opening a bottle of wine, pouring a glass of wine, sitting down and having it with a meal. People will still look for that. I think the younger generation, so Gen Z, will, take on all sorts of different products which don't necessarily look to replicate or are less influenced by traditional alcoholic products. And that is a complete, white space or blue ocean or whatever startup phrase you want to use for that. And who knows what that will look like. And I think a great example of a business which has absolutely capitalized on that and really nailed it there is Trip. Trip CBD. They have a fantastic product. It appeals to all sorts of different age groups, demographics. But that to me is a product that will continue to own that space, and that's where you'll see soft drink players come in. You'll see alcoholic players come in. That will be just
evolve in
ways that I am not clever or creative enough to understand. But I think what we'll see on the side of the market that we're in is that you'll see advances in technology and an investment in different approaches that will allow us to get ever closer to creating really, really interesting liquids that replicate that experience of drinking a glass of wine, having having a pint, whatever it is. And that's really interesting. And then the question from there becomes why do people drink and where does alcohol fit into our lives? And I think there will always be a role for alcohol in most people's lives. It's just a case of how that sits alongside non-alcoholic or alcohol-free products.
Amazing, brilliant, love it. So, and what is the what does the next 5 years look like for you? What are your ambitions? What are your goals with the business? Obviously, you're still fairly early in your journey. There's loads more to achieve, but where do you want the business to be in 5 years? Yeah,
again, it's something that I think a lot about, and we were talking just beforehand about fundraising and a vision and I touched upon visions and that sort of thing. I think ultimately we want to become our customers' default midweek wine alternative, and I think that idea of being a wine alternative is really interesting because it's actually quite an open concept or phrase. And so what I think that will look like is we have a few different opportunities. We can either expand as a business kind of horizontally, so we can look to release lots of different products, or we can go vertically. We can look to be in lots of different formats, whether that's cans or kegs or boxes. There's loads of, and then different markets, different geographies, all that sort of stuff. What I think will look like in 5 years is and what I hope we look like is a business that has a core range of products that are available in an enormous variety of different locations, channels, countries. And then around that, we're starting to innovate with kind of smaller ranges, limited edition, one-off products that we can use to engage our audience, but also, different partners and customers. So Wednesdays Domaine may have, still and sparkling, non-alcoholic or alcohol-free wines, but we're also releasing limited edition options that, as I said, maybe for restaurant partners, or they may be US only. One of the interesting things which I really don't know about yet is whether we'll go into low alcohol wine as well, which I think is a space we haven't touched on. But when I'm talking about low alcohol wine, I'm talking 3 to 6%, which I've always thought of historically as something that I don't really get. I don't understand why you drink it, but the more I think about it, the more, if you can replicate that flavor, why do people actually drink a 12% wine? And actually, what I think you'll see is a steady reduction in ABV, and that's where I think there might be quite an interesting opportunity for us to be a no and low, a genuine no and low business. But I think right now it's too distracting. We don't have the resource. It's also too early in the kind of consumer adoption of no and low. Non-alcoholic is confusing enough. As we were talking earlier, non-alcoholic wine, what even is that? And so a low alcohol wine is like, we're not there yet.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, I heard something around no beer. Change the subject from wine to beer, but no beer can be 0.0% because if it's been properly, is it fermented? And because even a banana has a certain level of alcohol in, doesn't it?
Exactly. Like so Lucky Saint will talk a lot about that in terms of 0.5%. Their beer is 0.5%. That's the same amount of alcohol as a ripe banana. Or you hear people talk about ketchup and that sort of thing. So non-alcoholic is slightly confusing because it can be 0.5% or under. You can't get drunk drinking. You could have as many as you want, and your body will process it quick enough. So again, it's a really interesting debate within the industry. 0.5%, the argument is, gives you more flavor because the alcohol carries flavor, or the ethanol carries flavor. 0.0 is a true non-alcoholic, but there's an argument that you sacrifice flavor. The flip side of that is you don't limit export opportunities. You can go into the Middle East, absolutely no problem. You can't sell a 0.5% drink into certainly not dry, truly dry
Saudi,
markets,
for example,
yeah.
or something. Oh, interesting, brilliant. I didn't know that. Something you learn something new every day.
Yeah.
So two final questions.
Of course.
The first one is, what has been your biggest learning over this sort of 1.5, 2 year period of founding the business all the way to today? What's the biggest learning and takeaway that you've sort of...
The biggest learning or takeaway is probably, I'm actually going to answer that in two ways. Yeah. One is everything takes longer than you think it's going to, which we touched on briefly before. Yeah. Everything takes longer. Things will go wrong. Yeah. Things don't go as you planned. And you just need to be comfortable in that. Mm-hmm. That's not to say that you should accept that things take a long time, but it's just when you're planning, when you're thinking about time horizons, it always takes longer. It's
like aggressive patience. I've heard someone...
Exactly.
Like, you've still got to be persistent, but you've got to understand that it's going to be slower than...
Exactly. Aggressive patience. And I think the other learning is, I'm so glad I did a lot of thinking up front about the type of business I want to set up, because, I'm almost 3 years into doing this now, from first conceptualizing it through to today. And... we're barely even scratching the surface, and it sounds cliched. We are just getting started, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. But conceivably, I'm going to be doing this for the next 10 years, and I couldn't be more excited about that. But if I'd gone into another industry because it was a hot industry, or there was money flowing in, or I thought there was a kind of opportunity, that doesn't survive those kind of long nights of the soul where you're thinking, can I do this? Am I an idiot? Is this possible? That doesn't get you up early in the morning. That doesn't help you push through the really difficult times. That doesn't help you say no to things with family and friends that you want to do because you need to work. So really doing that thinking up front is I'm so glad I did that. So that's a takeaway, a learning, something I would share with other people thinking about it.
Amazing, brilliant. And then the last question that we've got is around, let's go back to the start of the journey in terms of what's the one piece of advice you'd give yourself now after all these learnings, or to any other person that's looking to set up a business. What's the one piece of advice that you'd give that person?
I would probably say ask lots of questions. Don't and remove your ego from that. Remove any assumptions you have, remove any preconceptions you have, and just be open to what you hear back, basically. So ask lots of questions, listen to the answers, make lots of notes, and you'll be amazed what kind of comes out of that.
Amazing. It's funny you say that, because we had a guest on earlier, which I spoke about. His response was exactly the same.
Really? Okay.
Listen more than you talk. Yeah. He said, obviously two of these, one of these, listen. The amount of, people that don't, they go into a room with, people who you can learn a lot from, and they just talk. It's like, if you can, digest and listen and take it all on board. But I love that.
And there's a deep irony to me saying that, having just whistled on and spoken at you for about an hour now.
Listen, but I'm asking. I'm listening. I'm taking it all in.
But that is the nature of the beast today. Ordinarily, I wouldn't talk this much.
Amazing. No, love it. Well, like an unbelievable story. You've done, some great stuff, and we wish you all the success. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Brilliant.
Cheers.
Thank you. Cheers.